Bard on the Plains podcast with Mike McPeak. It's about stories, mine and yours.
Even though I'm not the best Christian, the church still holds quite a few memories for me. Not only was it a place of worship, it was also a place where neighbors got together, talked, shared ideas, and offered to help one another. Let me just start by describing the building. It is a true country church located in Hague Township of Clark County, South Dakota, along a desolate township road, with the nearest house being a quarter mile to the north and our house about a mile to the west. If you don't count the entryway, it was a single-room church roughly 40 feet wide and about 70 feet long. It was heated by a wall furnace in the back and a freestanding oil burner in the front. In the wintertime, the heat was never running during the week to keep costs down. There was no water in the building to freeze up, so that wasn't an issue. Somebody would always have to come down there early on Sunday or on Saturday night if the weather was really cold to start the furnace up so that it would be comfortable for services on Sunday morning. Or at least you hoped it would be comfortable. Sometimes the pews were still cool yet and might shock a somewhat sleepy person awake rather quickly. Seeing as how there was no water, that meant that the only bathroom was a little shed out back. With church services only being an hour long, most people didn't have to worry about going to the bathroom. They would either take care of it before or after services because nobody really wanted to go out there, especially in the wintertime, if you could even get to it because of the snowdrifts, as it was set about 40 feet behind the church. The pews were about 12 feet long, one on either side of the aisle with a couple feet on either end between the pew and the wall. At the front of the church was a raised platform that held the lectern, baptismal font, and a small open-door room for the pastor to change into his robes and hang his coat up. The altar always fascinated me as a kid. When I got older, I found out it was a unique altar. There was only one other like it, and that was in a church in Wisconsin. At the front, you had the altar where the candles, Bible, and Holy Communion wine and wafers were set up. But if you walked around behind it and up several stairs, there was this area where the pastor read the sermon. He stood about 5 feet in the air and looked down upon the congregation. The altar, pews, and baptismal font and the hymnal board all had carved wood accents that gave them a very ornate look. To the left of the altar, hanging on the wall, was a hymnal board that told us what hymn numbers that we'd be singing that day. The deacon would go up before church was to start and slide the old numbers out and put the new numbers in. When you came in, you had to grab a hymnal from the back, or the usher would make sure that you had one. Unless, of course, you were someone like my mom who had her own hymnal with her name embossed on it. The congregation was small, I'll say about 100 people or so. Roughly 30 or 40 people would usually show up for services, and sometimes even less than that. There was a piano up front to play music, but if the piano player was sick or we couldn't get anybody to play, we just read the hymns out loud. As I remember, there was a few people who could sing fairly well, but most people were just, let's say, average in their singing ability, so there wasn't much difference sometimes between reading it and singing. About 2/3 of the way through the service, after the sermon had been read, the offering plate would be passed around. It was a round carved wooden plate with red felt at the bottom, so that if anyone was dropping coins, you wouldn't hear them bouncing off the bottom of the plate and making a racket to disturb the silent and somber ceremony. My mom told me that they used to take the collection with a bag at the end of the stick that the usher would hold in front of you, and you would drop your offering into that. At Christmas time, there would be the Christmas service. There would be a tree in the front of the church in the corner tucked in beside the hymnal board. All the Sunday school children would have a part to learn and Christmas songs to sing. So for several Sundays before Christmas, the children would have to stay after church and have their practice. I was never really crazy about this because I really wasn't big into memorizing parts, but it was good training for talking to a group of people. Sometimes the Sunday school classes would be really small, only about half a dozen kids, which would mean you'd have more parts to learn. On Christmas Eve, we would have our service. The congregation would sing, the pastor would have a sermon, and the children would do their performance. When the service was done, the usher would pass out brown paper bags to everyone. They would have a cup of peanuts, several pieces of Christmas candy, and an apple in it. I loved peanuts, so that I was always looking forward to getting the bag. The candy was good, and the apple I would eat sometimes, or else I would just give it to Mom. In our church, you could only take communion if you were confirmed. That meant that if you were born into the church about the time you were 14, you would take 2 years of confirmation class, take a test, and then stand before the congregation to answer questions and be confirmed into the church. If you were someone that married someone belonging to the church or decided to join, you would still have to take confirmation classes and meet the same requirements. They believed that taking communion without proper preparation would condemn a person's soul. When you entered the church, there was a notebook in the entryway that you had to sign to say that you were taking communion that day. And then when communion would start, the usher would go down row by row and send people to the front to wait their turn to receive communion. When it was your turn, you would stand before the pastor, and he would give you a sip of wine out of the communal cup, and then give you one of the wafers and confer a blessing upon you. Then you would go back to your pew where you would kneel down and say the Lord's Prayer, and then sit back down on the pew. Before I was old enough to receive communion, I always found this ritual kind of fascinating. There seemed to be a lot of solemn ceremony involved in it. To see my folks kneel and pray like that was an interesting experience. I never entirely felt comfortable in the church, both physically and mentally. Physically, the pews were hard and cold. In the summer, the building could get quite hot and stuffy. In the winter, when the sun was low, it would shine into your eyes through the south windows. As a kid, it was difficult to sit for an hour and not squirm. Mom and Dad wanted me to sit and listen to the sermon and not disturb others around me. I never had books to read or things to do like color like kids in church do nowadays. All those things I learned to deal with. It was the mental and spiritual issues that was harder to deal with. This was a Lutheran church of the strict variety. I referred to them as the German Lutherans, as in, you will do things this way or else. Everything in the Bible was the unerring Word of God and could not be questioned. Using that rationale, women were not allowed to vote in church meetings because the Bible says that the man is the head of the household, and that was that. To be fair, though, they also said that a man's place was to love, protect, and provide for his wife and children, and treat them with respect. I was taught to love and respect women, but that they weren't equal to me, which didn't seem right. And then there was the guilt. Every Sunday we would hear about the sinful and fallen nature of man and why we needed a Savior. The love God showed us by sending His Son to die for us was preached, but for me it was the message of guilt and damnation that seemed to occupy the space in my head. Sometimes when I was feeling responsible for things beyond my control, I say I'm just being a little bit too Lutheran. But I did learn things that have helped me, such as there are consequences to your action, the responsibility to your community and others around you, and the need for a society that protects people while encouraging them to be the best that they can be. Our church was small enough that we couldn't afford a pastor by ourselves, so we would have a sister church in town that would share the costs with us. He would preach the country service in the morning, usually about 9 o'clock, and then drive to Willow Lake to do the service there, usually about 11. Since I went to school in Willow Lake, we had our confirmation classes with the church there. The year that I was confirmed, there was only one other boy in the class, and he was confirmed in Willow Lake. So I was the only one in our country church to be confirmed. Since there was no basement under the church, we had to make arrangements with the township to use the country school as our gathering place for special events. When I was growing up, the country school had already been closed and the kids were going to school in Willow Lake. I was the only one out of us 5 kids that never went to the country school. It was used as a meeting hall where the township meetings were held and the records were kept. The church could use it for gatherings and was available for people to rent. The school was a square building, a 1-classroom schoolhouse. On the west side there was 3 rooms, One had been converted into a kitchen with stove and some cabinets, but no running water. The next room had a pitcher and a basin to wash your hands in, and a water cooler for drinking water. The last room was the cloakroom, where you could hang your coats and hat. There was a basement, which was just this large square room with cement walls. In the front door going into the kitchen was a big floor furnace with a fan that blew the heat up into the room. In cold weather, a lot of people liked to stand over that because it was the warmest place in the building. In the rest of the upstairs, in what would have been the classroom, was the meeting area with the tables of different sizes set around for seating and serving meals. The chalkboards were still in the front of the room, so the kids would amuse themselves by writing on them or playing a game of hangman while the adults were doing their thing. On one side was a row of windows, so in the daytime there was plenty of daylight coming in. Again, since there was no running water, bathroom facilities were two little outhouses across the driveway from the school. Business meetings were held in the church, but all the other gatherings were in the school. Sometimes this would be Christmas parties, mission festivals, and church dinners. Also for entertainment, the church would sometimes have card parties. The games of choice were usually pinochle or canasta. I remember when I got old enough and learned to play the game, I played a few hands, but usually it involved me watching my dad play. The church was located about a mile to the east of the farm, and the school was just around the curves on the road from the farm to the west. So it was only several hundred yards from the house, sitting on a few acres taken out of the half section of the land that we own. So when I got old enough and bored of being around the old people, I could always walk from the school back to the house and entertain myself. But sometimes there would be a few kids there my age or close enough in age that we could entertain ourselves without too many problems. Sometimes we'd run around and play tag, usually outside, but if the weather was nasty, we could do it down in the basement until the adults would come down and tell us to quit making so much noise. Since the school sat on a small hill in the country, there were gopher holes around, so sometimes we'd get some twine string and make a loop and put it around a gopher hole. Then we'd sit there and whistle until a gopher popped its head out, and then we'd pull on the string to capture it. This was something that was done quite often because we didn't want gophers digging holes around the school for someone to step in and fall. I usually wasn't the one to kill the gophers because that wasn't in my nature to do that. As we got a little older, sometimes we would sit in someone's car and listen to the AM radio and talk. I remember one time there was a couple of us boys in a car and we were listening to the Dr. Demento show. I seem to remember they were playing the novelty song, "They're Coming to Take Me Away, Ha Ha." On the other side of the road was a creek that ran through the pasture with a bridge over it. Sometimes we walked down there and explore and see what kind of wildlife we could find in the creek bed. This was also the local sledding hill. Since this part of South Dakota is usually flat, there aren't too many places where you have hills long enough to go sledding on, and the one across from the school was one of those few places. So sometimes people would rent the schoolhouse, go sledding on the hill across the road, and then come back and have some hot chocolate, something to eat, and make a party of it. So I grew up, I took over the farm, got married, and had kids. My oldest two boys were baptized in this church. I don't have the records, but I believe they were probably one of the last two children to be baptized there. As time moved on and children moved away, people passed on, the congregation grew smaller until finally we realized that we couldn't keep the church open any longer. I was elected church president to help with the closing of the church. There were some tough decisions to be made. Fortunately, the congregation had had the foresight to plan for such an event and had been putting money away so that the cemetery, which was beside the church, would be taken care of. But there was still the matter of what to do with the building itself. A lot of us really wanted to maintain the building so that we could come back and have fond memories as we walked through the building. But we realized that was probably not going to happen, because at the time the average age of the congregation was just old. And the few willing and able bodies to take care of the building would have more work than they would be able to do. We were afraid that if we let it stand, age, weather, and animals of the four-legged and two-legged variety would cause the building to slowly decay and crumble. Eventually, we made the decision to have it torn down and the lumber used for something else rather than just to sit and watch it turn into a pitiful pile of rubble. I did get some friction from people about that decision, but they were also the ones that didn't come to church that often and didn't pay very much to help with the upkeep. Parts of the building are preserved. The altar, baptismal font, hymnal board, and 2 of the pews were donated to the Clark County Historical Society. From time to time, I go down there and look at the altar and relive old memories. After we closed the church, people had to make the decision which congregation they wanted to become part of. Since we were about equal distances from Clark and Willow Lake, we could go to either church because they were both part of the same synod. A lot of people in the Willow Lake Church were Mom's family and assumed that we would just go there. Sometimes this is kind of like being part of the mafia because they expect certain things of you. But Mom just didn't want to do the thing that that she was expected to do, so we ended up going to the church in Clark. This is where my youngest daughter was baptized, and all the kids went to Sunday school. Just before my daughter was to start confirmation, Mom, my wife, and I decided to leave this church and join a different Lutheran church in town. We were starting to have issues with their beliefs and their inflexible attitude. After my daughter was confirmed and my mom passed away, we slowly started drifting away from this church also. We don't go to church anymore right now, but I still maintain some of the beliefs I learned in both churches, and I'm always trying to figure out what it is I believe. I haven't abandoned the Christian faith. I'm just trying to come up with something that makes sense and fits into the world the way I see it. I went through a phase where I was an atheist, but after some reflection, I know that didn't make much sense. If you look at science and the intricate way that life works and the precise way things have to be to sustain life, it becomes increasingly difficult to say that there is no God. But religions have to be a little less rigid. I draw a distinction between faith and religion. Faith is following the 10 Commandments, being personally responsible and treating others well. Religion is the rules set up to enforce faith, which to me seems counterproductive. God gave us free will with all the rights and responsibilities that come with it. We need to be well educated on our rights and responsibilities as children of God and the consequences of our actions, which is the church's job, but to be more flexible with each other and open to other ideas. I don't have all the answers, and the ones that I do have, I have a hard time articulating. But we all have to be open to the discussion.
If you have a story you'd like to tell, contact Mike on Twitter at BardOnThePlains or by email at bardontheplains@gmail.com. For more information about the stories in this podcast, visit bardontheplains.com.